Anambra State Vigilante Group commander, is responsible for all the kidnappings and killings in Anambra. For months, Anambra was not a place of peace. It was a land haunted by whispers and shadows. Streets that once carried laughter now echoed with silence. The roads that led to markets and farmlands became pathways of fear. Parents clutched their children tighter, and every nightfall felt like a curse rather than a time of rest. The kidnappings were ruthless. Men disappeared on their way home. Young women were snatched under the cover of darkness. Traders were ambushed on highways. Entire communities were forced into mourning after faceless killers struck without warning. The people were afraid, and their fear had no name, only blood and silence. But in this darkness, there was one group that seemed to stand tall, the Anambra Vigilante Group. They were the ones people trusted when the official police could not cover every corner. They wore their uniforms with pride, patrolled the villages with torches and guns, and told the people, "Sleep, we are watching over you." At the center of it all was the commander. To many, he was more than just a leader, he was a savior. His presence alone was enough to calm a troubled village. Mothers prayed for him, fathers respected him, and children saw him as a hero. He spoke with authority, carried himself with discipline, and walked as if he truly carried the weight of his people on his shoulders. But the truth was darker than anyone could have imagined. Beneath the iron voice of a protector was a heart soaked in greed and cruelty. He was not the shield he claimed to be, he was the knife hidden in the darkness. And every kidnapping, every murder, every wave of terror in Anambra had his fingerprints all over it. The revelation did not come easily. For months, the police had been puzzled. They tightened patrols, increased checkpoints, and still the kidnappers struck with frightening accuracy. It was as if the criminals had eyes inside the very forces that were meant to stop them. The kidnappings felt too clean, too perfect, as though someone on the inside was pulling the strings. Then came the voice that broke the silence. A survivor. A man who had been kidnapped, brutalized, but somehow managed to escape alive. His body carried scars, but his voice carried a heavier truth. In tears, trembling and broken, he told the police the unthinkable. The man behind all this is the vigilante commander. The officers in the room froze. At first, they wanted to dismiss it. How could it be? How could the man who was sworn to protect the people be the mastermind of their destruction? But the survivor was not alone. Piece by piece, more testimonies began to surface. Whispers from informants. Clues from investigations. Names, dates, and hideouts, all traced back to him. The puzzle that had tormented Anambra for months was finally complete. The wolf had been wearing the skin of a shepherd. The revelation hit like a thunderstorm. Some officers felt sick to their stomachs. Others clenched their fists in rage. The betrayal was too heavy to swallow. This was not just another criminal. This was the very man they had respected, the man who shook their hands, the man who claimed to fight alongside them. But there was no more time for shock. Once the truth had been uncovered, a decision was made. He had to be stopped, immediately. The people of Anambra had been bleeding for too long. The man behind the mask of protection had to face the consequences of his evil. The raid was planned in silence. Only a handful of trusted officers were informed, because the betrayal ran too deep. Nobody knew how far his influence had spread. Nobody knew how many others were silently working for him in the shadows. It was decided that the operation would begin at dawn. While the world was still asleep, while the air was heavy with mist, the police would strike. The trucks rolled out in the early hours of the morning, engines growling like beasts in the distance. The sun had not yet risen, and the streets were cloaked in grey silence. Villagers, stirred by the rumble of tires and the sudden flash of police sirens, peeked from their windows. They had seen police operations before, but never with such urgency, never with such fire in the eyes of the men holding their guns. The convoy of black uniformed officers stormed into the commander's compound. His mansion stood tall, proud, and defiant, an image of wealth and authority built on the blood of innocents. Gates that once welcomed villagers were now torn open by force. Inside, the commander was already awake. He had been warned, though too late to escape properly. His men scattered like frightened dogs, leaving him to face the fury of those he had deceived. He tried to slip out through the back door, a bag of cash in one hand, a pistol in the other. But the police had anticipated his move. "Stop where you are!" The shout pierced the morning air. The commander bolted into the bush, desperate, panting, his once calculated steps now frantic. For years, he had been the hunter. But now, for the first time, he was the prey. Bullets cracked in the distance as the police fired warning shots. He stumbled, fell, scrambled to his feet again, but there was no escape. The noose of justice was tightening around him. He was finally cornered, dragged out of the dirt, his once proud face twisted with rage, disbelief, and fear. The villagers who had gathered could hardly believe their eyes. Their so-called protector, their commander, their savior, now in handcuffs, surrounded like a common criminal. But the police were not finished. The demolition began immediately. Bulldozers roared to life, their jaws biting into the walls of his mansion. Brick by brick, the house of betrayal collapsed. The once proud structure, built from the blood money of kidnappings and killings, crumbled into dust. The crowd that had gathered erupted in cries. Some shouted curses. Some wept bitterly. Mothers held up pictures of children who had vanished, their voices breaking as they screamed his name in fury. Fathers clenched their fists, unable to hold back the tears. The air was thick with dust and grief. Every crash of concrete, every falling wall, was like a drumbeat of justice. For the victims who never came home. For the families that had been broken. For the trust that had been betrayed. The commander, handcuffed, was forced to watch. His wealth, his influence, his pride, reduced to rubble before his very eyes. The people spat at him, their anger uncontainable. Yet beneath their rage, there was also sorrow. For years, they had believed in him. For years, they had called his name in prayers. And now, they stood face to face with the cruelest betrayal of all. His fall was not just the arrest of a man. It was the fall of trust itself. The commander sat in custody, his face hardened, his lips sealed. He refused to speak, refused to answer questions. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Weapons were uncovered. Secret accounts were exposed. Survivors testified. He was not just linked to the crimes, he was the very architect of them. Anambra wept. The shock rippled through every town, every village. Candlelight vigils lit up the night skies as people mourned the dead, the missing, the broken. Mothers brought faded photographs of their children, holding them high with trembling hands. Fathers knelt on the ground, praying for strength through their tears. The streets echoed with one heartbreaking question. If our protector could betray us, who then can we trust? This was the deepest wound. It was not only the deaths or the kidnappings, it was the betrayal of trust, the corruption of hope, the twisting of faith into a weapon. People no longer knew who to believe. Even the sound of a siren brought fear rather than comfort. But justice had spoken, and with it came a message: evil cannot hide forever. The demolition of the commander's house became more than just the destruction of a building. It became a symbol, a lesson carved into the soil of Anambra. A warning that no matter how high a man rises, no matter how respected his name, the truth will always rise higher. The pain of betrayal was heavy, but so too was the determination to rebuild. Communities began to rise from the ashes, promising themselves and their children, never again. The people became more vigilant. Leaders swore to carry the scars of this betrayal as a reminder to never look away again. The story of the commander would live on, not just as a tale of crime, but as a bitter lesson for generations. That evil often hides where you least expect it. That silence in the face of suspicion can cost lives. That no man is above justice. And as the nights in Anambra slowly grew quieter, as hope cautiously returned to the streets, the people knew one truth, that though their hearts were broken, they were not defeated. Justice had spoken. If this story shook you to the core, then let it remind you that betrayal often comes in the most unexpected form. Evil does not always wear the face of a stranger. It sometimes hides behind a smile, behind a uniform, behind a badge. Subscribe now, because more true, raw, heartbreaking stories are coming. Stories that will open your eyes and touch your heart.